What's up everyone, Darcblade here, returning with my Mass Effect 3 multiplayer class guide. Today we are going to be taking a look at our first Reckoning DLC character, the Geth Juggernaut. This guy is a powerhouse and he can take a hell of a lot of punishment. He is probably the toughest character in the game so far. Whilst he might not be able to dish out a high amount of damage, he can certainly take it. Now, like with all my characters, I spec them for the harder difficulties in the game. With the Geth Juggernaut, I put maximum points into Hex Shield, putting points into damage synergy over large shield. This is simply because I feel that the shield is not as useful as it could be. And having the damage synergy means that you can just put up the shield anywhere, regardless of its position, and still get a bonus from it. The large shield may be more useful on the smaller maps, however. I put points into Shock, simply because this enables you to put a debuff on enemies who pass through the shield. This debuff deals a damage over time electrical effect on them, and it also enables them to be set up for tech bursts. Finally, I put points into shield strength over pulse. This is simply because I wanted the shield to become more durable and won't instantly vanish after taking a certain amount of damage. As for the Geth Juggernaut's second ability, Siege Pulse, I put maximum points into it, putting points into number of shots over resistance damage. This was done primarily not to increase my DPS, because if I wanted to do that I would have took resist damage. This is because I wanted to evolve Evolution 5 even more so, because in rank 5 I put points into damage protection, which makes every charged shot of Siege Pulse give you 10% damage reduction. Normally you would have 30% damage reduction, but with points into number of shots, it means you can get 40% damage reduction. Lastly, I put points into radius, simply because of the knockdown effect. If I get swamped, I can knock down more enemies, giving me some room to breathe. Now, as for the Geth Juggernaut's final ability, Geth Turret, I completely avoided this tree. It does have some potential, especially if you make the turret a healing turret. Basically, if you want to sacrifice maybe the Hex Shield, you could put maximum points into Geth Turret, making it focus on returning your shields as often as possible. Finally, for the passive abilities, I say these are down to personal preference. Geth Juggernaut was a bit of a no-brainer, but for hardened platform, things got a bit interesting. Basically, the Geth Juggernaut's heavy melee allows him to return shields to him. So, I basically increased all the possibility of reducing the damage, increasing my health, increasing my shields, and increasing the amount of shields returned to me. Having points in power transfer should be sufficient enough for this, so I put points into melee damage instead of durability. If you're still not happy with your health and shields now, then maybe take durability instead of melee damage. Now, as for weaponry, you don't have to worry about getting a super quick recharge timer, so take what you want really. I wanted to go with the Geth Spitfire, but I didn't have it, so I went with other Geth weaponry. Although saying that, you could pretty much go with anything you want, to be honest. The only thing I would say is try to equip them with mods that increase your melee damage, as this will help kill them quicker as you're draining them with the Geth Juggernaut's heavy melee. Now, before we get into the heart of the episode, I want to say that this is a tanking build, and it is subject to change, because at the moment it does feel a little bit overpowered, so things might be different if you're watching this a few months from now. Anyway, let's get back on track and talk about the Geth Juggernaut's moves and abilities. Its first move, a unique move, is Hex Shield. Basically, the Geth Juggernaut spawns a Geth energy barrier that prevents all fast moving objects, including bullets, from passing through it. The Hex Shield will be spawned at the foot of the Geth Juggernaut, and this has some very good defensive implications. For example, setting up the barrier in a certain choke point can be a great defensive move to prevent you and your team from taking damage. Unfortunately though, it works both ways. For example, you can't actually shoot through the Hex Shield unless you have an armor piercing gun or modification on your gun. If you're in situations where you're very close to enemies, remember to drop the shield on top of enemies so they are affected with the shock damage, that damage over time debuff from the talent tree. Remember also that people who are affected by this shock debuff will be set up for tech burst that can be activated either with your Siege Pulse or by teammates' abilities. But on the whole, remember that the Hex Shield is primarily used as a defensive mechanism, so try putting it in the best place that will benefit you and your team from taking damage. Now the second move and ability available to the Geth Juggernaut is Siege Pulse. This is a nice little damage dealing move that is also defensive bonuses, so it's great for tanking too. This is as long as you've put points into damage protection in the Siege Pulse tree. Anyway, once you activate Siege Pulse, 3 to 4 charges will show up on the Geth Juggernaut's right shoulder. This will indicate how many shots you have with the Siege Pulse before you actually have to recharge. Every time you press the Siege Pulse ability, you will fire one of these shots. Now, as well as doing some nice damage, these shots have the potential to completely knock over unprotected targets. These shots also have the potential to stagger larger opponents too. You should also be aware that each shot from the Siege Pulse has a fairly large radius, so it can affect multiple enemies with each shot. This makes the Siege Pulse a great tool when you're in a tightened room with lots of weaker enemies. Now, however, if you're playing the Geth Juggernaut like I am in this video, you have to be aware that firing the Siege Pulse is only in situations where you know you're not going to take too much damage. If you're going to go into a situation where you're going to be tanking an Atlas head-on or tanking multiple Brutes or Banshees, then you need to have every one of them shots on your shoulder. Don't fire a single one because you need damage reduction at its maximum. Now the Siege Pulse does have a fairly long cooldown, but it's not too bad because the Siege Pulse doesn't actually start the recharge circle until you've actually used the ability to spawn your 3 to 4 shots. Interestingly, the Siege Pulse actually sounds like the Geth Prime's main weapon firing. I want to note that if I was doing a different build, a damage-based build for the Geth Juggernaut, then the Siege Pulse would probably be the main focus, and I would put points differently in the Siege Pulse tree to increase the maximum damage output this character can do. Now the third and final ability of the Geth Juggernaut is Geth Turret. I've explained this before in another video, the Geth Engineer, but with the Geth Juggernaut I've actually missed out the turret. Although, putting points into the Geth Turret could be viable, especially if you put points into the healing mechanics of the Geth Turret. The fact that it can restore shields and the frequency of it restoring shields could be quite beneficial to a tanking build for the Geth Juggernaut. But with this build I've decided to ignore the Geth Turret in favour for other aspects of the Geth Juggernaut. Thus I won't dwell on it any longer. Now one thing I want to talk about, which isn't really a ability as such, it's a racial, and that is the Geth Juggernaut's heavy melee. It is very unique and key to being a successful Geth Juggernaut tank. This is because the Geth Juggernaut's heavy melee has the ability to stun and drain enemies' life force. Shields, armor, it can all be drained basically, returning shields to the Geth Juggernaut. On top of that, the Geth Juggernaut has a very unique factor, and that is, at the moment, it cannot be sync killed, it cannot be insta killed. So basically, Banshees can't pick up the Geth Juggernaut and slam a fist through his heart. Phantoms can't stab him with their little swords. Basically, anything that would one-hit kill any other character cannot be done to the Geth Juggernaut. Combine this with the fact that the Geth Juggernaut is incredibly hard to stagger. I think there's only a few moves in the entire game that can actually cause him to stagger. Means that you've got a very tough character who's able to restore his shields and keep himself alive easily. In the games I've played with him, I've tanked multiple Atlases, I've tanked multiple Banshees with this character. He is quite powerful. One thing to be aware of though is that the heavy melee seems to have a little tiny bit of a cooldown. It's only like a second, but this can sometimes cause the death of the Geth Juggernaut, so be aware of this when you're in a tanking situation with multiple opponents around you. Also be aware that I found that whoever you heavy meleeed, you got aggro from. This is great at tanking basically, so you could get the attention of harder, tougher opponents away from your teammates and onto you. Now, as for the Geth Juggernaut's passive abilities, like I said, down to personal preference normally. For Geth Juggernaut I pretty much put points into increasing my weapon damage as I wasn't relying on my powers as this was a tanking spec. As for hardened platform, like I said, I wanted to increase my health and shields as well as the power transfer as much as possible, although I did think it was overkill by putting points both in power transfer and durability. Having said that, I only really tried this guy on gold. If I was going for platinum, then it might be more advisable to put points in both power transfer and durability. Now the Geth Juggernaut is a Geth, but he is different. He is very slow. He cannot sprint, he cannot take cover. But this is because he has a huge health and shield pool, like I said. His light melee is a simple AoE pulse around him, nothing too special to say about that. He has no dodge, but that's because he's so big. Overall, at the time of making this video, the Geth Juggernaut might be the most overpowered class in the game. He is a beast, able to tank anything in the game. With a Geth Juggernaut who's played right and who's tanking, gold mode will seem easy. Anyway, I've been Darcblade, bringing you my guide to the Geth Juggernaut in Mass Effect 3's multiplayer. Hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching. Subscribe and like for more.